I was sipping my morning coffee, letting the warmth of the cup seep into my hands as I enjoyed the peaceful silence of my new home. The house was everything I had dreamed of, spacious, quiet, and located in a seemingly friendly neighborhood. I had moved in just 2 months ago, eager to settle into what I hoped would be a stress-free life. But that dream was shattered when I heard a sharp knock at the door. It wasn't the casual kind of knock that neighbors give when they come by for a friendly chat. No, this was a firm, authoritative knock, the kind that made you feel like you were already in trouble before even opening the door. I placed my coffee down, took a deep breath, and opened the door. Standing there was a man in a cheap suit, his face stretched into a smug smirk. Behind him stood two other individuals, one holding a clipboard, the other crossing their arms like a bouncer at a club. The man in the suit cleared his throat and extended a piece of paper toward me, not even bothering with a greeting. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice dripping with fake politeness, "we regret to inform you that you are in violation of multiple HOA regulations. As a result, you have 30 days to vacate your property." I blinked, trying to process what I had just heard. "Excuse me," I said, taking the paper from his hand and scanning through it. "Your lawn is 3 inches too high," he continued, folding his arms as if this was some kind of serious crime. "Your mailbox is 2 shades darker than the HOA-approved colors, and your garbage bin was visible from the street during non-collection hours. These infractions are unacceptable, and as per HOA regulations, you are being evicted." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. Surely this had to be a joke, but his smug expression told me otherwise. The two individuals behind him shifted slightly, as if they were already anticipating a reaction. The arrogance in their stance was infuriating. It was clear they had done this before, probably expecting me to panic, beg, or comply without a fight. "You're evicting me over a mailbox color and a trash bin?" I asked, my voice laced with disbelief. The man nodded as if he had just explained the most logical thing in the world. "And your lawn," he added. "It's important that the neighborhood maintains a certain aesthetic. Rules exist for a reason." I let out a slow exhale and fought the urge to laugh. These people had no idea who they were messing with. They saw me as just another homeowner, someone they could bully with their ridiculous rules. But they didn't know the full story. They didn't know that I had spent the last few months researching this neighborhood before I moved in. They didn't know that I had come into possession of something very valuable, something that would change everything. But I wasn't going to reveal my cards just yet. I gave them a neutral expression and folded my arms. "And who exactly are you?" I asked, even though I already knew. The man straightened his back, clearly pleased that I was asking. "I'm Gregory, the president of the Homeowners Association," he said with an air of self-importance. "And these are board members Peter and Laura." Peter, the man with the clipboard, gave me a curt nod. Laura just sneered as if she had already won some battle against me. I had met that kind before. People who thrived on power trips, relishing any chance to control others over the pettiest of rules. They weren't here to help the community. They were here to feed their egos. 30 days, Gregory repeated. Failure to comply will result in legal action. With that, they turned and strutted away like they had already won. I watched them go, my mind running through a dozen different ways I could handle this situation. I wasn't mad. No, I was amused. They had no idea what was coming. I went back inside, still holding the eviction notice, and sat down at my kitchen table. I read through it carefully, looking for any loopholes. Not that I needed one. I already knew something that Gregory didn't, but it was always good to be thorough. The language in the notice was aggressive, designed to intimidate homeowners into submission. I could imagine how many people had been pressured into giving up their homes, scared off by these ridiculous fines and technicalities. But I wasn't one of them. I reached for my laptop and pulled up some documents I had been reviewing just last week. See, the thing about HOAs is that they operate like little kingdoms. But even kingdoms can crumble if they are built on weak foundations. This particular HOA had made a mistake, a big one. In their greed, they had accumulated too much debt. They had been reckless with their spending, using homeowners' fees for unnecessary renovations, personal expenses, and even frivolous lawsuits against residents who dared to challenge them. And that debt? It had been sold off to me. I owned it. I owned them. I had quietly purchased all the outstanding HOA debt a month ago, acquiring control over the association's financial liabilities. What Gregory and his board members didn't realize was that their power was hanging by a thread. They were broke, and they didn't even know who their real creditor was. I smiled to myself. I could have walked into the last HOA meeting and revealed everything right away, but I had decided to wait. I wanted to see just how far they would go before they realized the trap they had walked into. And now, they had made their move. They had declared war, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the one holding all the weapons. I leaned back in my chair and thought about my next step. I could send them a formal notice immediately, informing them that I was their new financial overlord. But where was the fun in that? No, I wanted to drag this out just a little longer. I wanted to let them bask in their false sense of victory before I yanked the rug out from under them. This was going to be fun. The next day, I attended an HOA meeting, something I had deliberately avoided until now. I walked in, keeping my expression neutral, and took a seat in the back. The room was filled with homeowners, most of them looking exhausted and frustrated. It was clear that Gregory and his board had been making life miserable for them. Gregory spotted me and smirked, probably thinking I was here to beg for mercy or make some kind of desperate appeal. He tapped his papers against the table and leaned forward. "We have a lot to discuss today," he began. "First, we'll address ongoing violations. Then, we'll be introducing new HOA regulations to maintain the integrity of our neighborhood." I watched him, waiting, letting him bask in his power for just a little longer, because soon, he was going to realize that everything he thought he controlled was already in my hands. I wasn't just another homeowner. I was the man who owned the entire HOA, and Gregory had just made the biggest mistake of his life. I sat in the back of the HOA meeting, watching as Gregory and his board members continued their self-important speech about maintaining the integrity of the neighborhood. They spoke in circles, throwing around vague terms about order and harmony, but all I could hear was their desperate need for control. The homeowners in the room didn't look convinced. Some had their arms crossed, others looked frustrated, and a few simply stared at the floor, defeated. It was obvious that Gregory had been running this HOA like a dictatorship for far too long. I leaned back in my chair, taking in the scene, letting the tension build. I wasn't going to make my move just yet. I wanted to see exactly how deep this corruption ran. I listened as they rolled out new regulations, each one more ridiculous than the last. A new fine for leaving holiday decorations up more than 3 days past the official holiday. A penalty for anyone whose car had visible dirt on it while parked in their driveway. A mandatory HOA inspection of backyards to ensure all fences match the approved style and color. The list went on, each rule clearly designed to squeeze more money out of the homeowners. When they finally finished, Gregory leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, clearly enjoying the discomfort in the room. He adjusted his glasses and smirked. "These rules are necessary to keep property values high and ensure our neighborhood remains one of the most desirable in the city," he said in his usual smug tone. "Any concerns or objections?" Silence. People wanted to object. I could see it in their faces, but they were scared. Gregory had likely shut them down before, probably with threats of fines or legal action. A woman near the front opened her mouth as if she wanted to speak, but hesitated. Her husband nudged her, shaking his head silently, telling her not to start anything. I knew this tactic well. Fear was Gregory's greatest weapon, and he had wielded it with precision for years. I decided to push a little. I raised my hand casually. Gregory's eyes met mine, and for a brief second, I saw a flicker of surprise. He hadn't expected me to speak. Maybe he thought I wouldn't even show up to the meeting, that I'd be too busy panicking over my supposed eviction. He quickly masked his surprise with a smirk. "Yes, Mr. Carter," he said, feigning politeness. "Do you have a question or concern?" I smiled back. "Just curious," I said, my voice calm. "How exactly does the HOA plan to enforce all these new regulations?" Gregory sat up straighter, clearly prepared for this. "The same way we always do," he said smoothly. "Fines, warnings, legal action if necessary. If homeowners refuse to comply, we escalate accordingly. That's how we maintain order." I nodded, pretending to consider his words. "And what happens if the HOA itself is in violation of its own policies?" I asked. Gregory frowned. The room suddenly felt more alert. People shifted in their seats, sensing something different in the conversation. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice carrying a slight edge. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Well, for example, let's say the HOA has financial obligations it hasn't been meeting. Say it's in debt. Say that debt was acquired by a third party. Wouldn't that technically put the HOA in violation of its own rules regarding financial responsibility?" Gregory stiffened. The smugness in his expression wavered for just a second. That's not something homeowners need to worry about, he said quickly. The HOA operates independently of individual finances. I tilted my head. Are you sure about that? Silence again. The tension in the room was growing. Other homeowners were starting to pay closer attention. I could see the curiosity in their eyes. This was new. They had been living under Gregory's rule for so long that they had forgotten what it was like to see him challenged. Peter, the board member with the clipboard, leaned over and whispered something to Gregory. Gregory waved him off, but kept his eyes locked on me. Mr. Carter, he said, his voice slightly less confident. Unless you have a relevant concern regarding the new regulation, I suggest we move on. I smiled, letting the moment hang in the air. I wasn't going to push too far just yet. I wanted him to feel safe, to think he still had control. No further questions, I said, leaning back again. Gregory cleared his throat and quickly moved on with the meeting, but I could tell he was rattled. He was second-guessing himself. I had planted the seed of doubt, and now it was only a matter of time before it grew. When the meeting finally ended, I didn't rush out like the others. I took my time, watching as Gregory and his board members huddled together, whispering. I knew what they were talking about. They were wondering if I was bluffing, if I had some kind of knowledge they didn't. As I walked out, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Peter catching up. He was holding his clipboard like a shield, his eyes darting around as if making sure no one else could hear him. Carter, he said, lowering his voice. What was that about? I raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? That thing about the HOA's financial obligations. What do you know? His voice was tight, like he was hoping I'd say it was nothing, that I was just making idle conversation. I let a small smile form. Guess we'll find out soon, I said, then walked away without another word. That night, I went through my documents again, reviewing every detail of my acquisition. The HOA owed a significant amount of money, and the debt had been transferred to me through a holding company I owned. They didn't know it yet, but I controlled their financial future. The plan was simple. I was going to let them keep up their act for a little longer, let them believe they were still in charge. Then, when the time was right, I was going to call in the debt. Legally, they would have no choice but to hand over control to me. Gregory and his board thought they were untouchable. They thought they could bully people with their petty rules and outrageous fines. But they were about to learn a harsh lesson. I wasn't just another homeowner. I was the man who now owned their entire operation. And soon, I was going to show them exactly what that meant. I spent the next few weeks quietly laying the groundwork for what was coming. I didn't want to rush things. Gregory and his board still had no idea that I controlled the HOA's financial future, and I wanted to keep it that way until the perfect moment. In the meantime, I focused on gathering allies. The homeowners were fed up with the board, but they were scared. Years of intimidation had worn them down, making them believe that fighting back was impossible. I needed to change that mindset before I made my move. I started small. Casual conversations with my neighbors turned into subtle, fact-finding missions. I learned that nearly everyone had been fined at some point for absurd reasons. One man had been penalized for having his garage door open for too long while he was cleaning it. A woman was fined because her potted plants weren't considered aesthetically appropriate. Another family had been threatened with legal action because their kids' bicycles were left on the driveway instead of stored out of sight. The more stories I heard, the more obvious it became that Gregory had turned the HOA into a personal kingdom where he ruled through fear and greed. The key to taking him down wasn't just exposing the financial side of things. That would come later. First, I needed the homeowners to realize they had power. I started attending more HOA meetings, asking pointed questions, and planting seeds of doubt in the board's authority. I never pushed too hard, just enough to make people think. I could see the shift happening. More and more homeowners began speaking up, questioning the rules that had long been taken as law. Gregory didn't like it. His smug confidence had started to crack. He interrupted people more often, dismissed concerns without addressing them, and even threatened to end meetings early when the questions became too pointed. Then came the opportunity one had been waiting for. The HOA was holding an election for board members. Normally, these elections were a joke. Gregory and his cronies controlled the process, making sure that no real opposition ever had a chance. But this time, things were different. Enough people were angry. Enough people were talking. And the idea of change was spreading. I saw my opening and took it. I spent the next few days quietly meeting with key homeowners, the ones who were the most vocal about their frustrations. I explained my plan. I told them I would cover their HOA fees for the next year if they agreed to vote against Gregory's board. I didn't need to buy their votes. I just needed to make sure they had no fear of retaliation. If they weren't paying HOA fees out of their own pockets, they had nothing to lose by pushing back. The reaction was overwhelming. People were ready. They just needed the final push. On election night, the tension in the room was thick. Gregory was seated at the front, his usual smugness tempered by a hint of unease. He could sense the shift, even if he didn't fully understand what was happening. The turnout was higher than usual. Homeowners who had never bothered to vote before were here, and they weren't just here to watch. They were here to make a change. When the voting began, I sat back and let it play out. Gregory looked confident at first, but as the votes were counted, his expression slowly changed. His name wasn't coming up as much as he had expected. Neither were the names of his usual allies. Instead, new names were leading the count. Names of people who had been too afraid to run before, but had now stepped up, knowing they had support. When the final count was announced, the room erupted. Gregory and his entire board had been voted out. The homeowners cheered, clapping and shouting, their years of frustration finally breaking free. Gregory stood up, his face red with shock and anger. He looked around as if hoping someone would step in and fix this for him. But no one did. His power was gone. I watched him carefully. He was calculating, trying to figure out his next move. He wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. He would try something, anything, to hold on. I decided to speed things along. I stood up and cleared my throat, making sure my voice carried over the noise. Now that we have a new board, I said, I think it's time we take a closer look at the HOA's financial situation. The room quieted. Gregory turned to me, eyes narrowing. He knew exactly what I was implying, but he didn't know how much I actually knew. The previous board made a lot of financial decisions that affected all of us. I continued, I think we should go over the books, see where our money has been going, and figure out how to move forward in a way that benefits the entire neighborhood. Murmurs of agreement spread through the room. The new board members nodded. Gregory looked like he was about to explode. There's no need for that, he snapped. The HOA's finances are in order. If that's true, I said, keeping my voice calm, then there shouldn't be a problem with transparency. His jaw tightened. He knew he was cornered. If he fought back too hard, it would only make him look guilty. If he agreed, the truth would come out. Either way, he was trapped. The new board agreed to an immediate review of the finances. I didn't even need to push them. They were just as eager as the homeowners to see what had been happening behind the scenes. Over the next few days, we went through everything. And what we found was worse than I expected. Gregory had been misusing HOA funds for years. Money that was supposed to go toward neighborhood improvements had instead been funneled into absurd expenses. Luxury vacations labeled as business retreats, expensive dinners charged as board meetings, thousands spent on legal fees for frivolous lawsuits against homeowners. The list went on. It wasn't just incompetence, it was outright corruption. When the findings were made public, Gregory's remaining support crumbled. Homeowners who had once feared him now wanted him held accountable. People were demanding refunds, threatening to sue, calling for law enforcement to get involved. Gregory tried to fight back, claiming everything was justified, that he had done nothing wrong. But no one believed him. His reign was over. I watched as he packed up his things from the HOA office, his hands shaking with barely contained rage. He glanced at me once, his eyes filled with hatred. I smiled. You should have been more careful, I said. You never know who you're messing with. He didn't reply. He just turned and walked away. But I wasn't done yet. Now that the board was gone, it was time for the final move. I gathered the new board members and explained the real situation. The HOA wasn't just financially unstable, it was in debt, and the entity that held that debt was me. At first, they panicked, but I reassured them. I didn't buy the debt to exploit them, I bought it to fix things. The HOA was now under my control. But instead of using that control to dominate the neighborhood like Gregory had, I was going to dismantle everything he had built. The next board meeting was the most satisfying one yet. I officially nullified every ridiculous fine, slashed HOA fees, and removed all unnecessary regulations. Homeowners cheered as we systematically erased the nightmare that Gregory had created. By the end of the night, the HOA was unrecognizable. It was no longer a tool for control, but a true community organization meant to help people. And best of all, Gregory was completely powerless to stop it. He had tried to evict me, but now he was the one being forced out. The downfall of Gregory and his board had sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. The homeowners, once too afraid to speak up, now moved with a sense of liberation. They no longer tiptoed around ridiculous rules, no longer hesitated before making simple decisions about their own homes. The mood had shifted from quiet frustration to a bubbling excitement. People were realizing they had power, and that power had been stolen from them for far too long. But my work wasn't finished yet. Gregory may have been ousted, but his legacy still lingered in the form of unfair policies, absurd fines, and years of damage that needed undoing. One of the first things I did was call for a full audit of the HOA's accounts. Now that the books were open, it was time to figure out exactly how deep the corruption ran. The new board members, still getting used to their positions, hesitated at first. The idea of challenging what had been in place for so long made them nervous. But I reassured them. They weren't alone anymore. Homeowners were on their side now, and more importantly, the people who had once controlled them were gone. With that understanding, they agreed, and the numbers started coming in. The findings were even worse than we had anticipated. Gregory had not only been misusing HOA funds for personal gain, but he had also been siphoning money into fake improvement projects that had never actually happened. Repairs that were supposedly done on neighborhood infrastructure had been nothing more than invoices sent to shell companies. Landscaping fees were triple what they should have been, and the so-called mandatory community security service had been nothing more than Gregory's way of paying off his personal acquaintances. It wasn't just mismanagement, it was full-blown fraud. As we sorted through the mess, the question arose, what were we going to do about it? Homeowners wanted justice, some even suggesting a lawsuit, while others wanted to erase everything Gregory had ever put in place. I understood their frustration, but I knew that dismantling the HOA overnight wasn't the best approach. People still needed structure, just not the kind that had been weaponized against them. So, instead of destroying it completely, I proposed something better. We held another meeting, one that was unlike any other in the neighborhood's history. This time, instead of rules being dictated from a position of unchecked power, we opened the floor to discussion. Everyone was invited to voice their opinions, to propose ideas about how the HOA should function moving forward. Homeowners who had once been silent spectators at these meetings now took the lead. Some suggested scrapping the fines altogether. Others wanted a complete reevaluation of how money was spent. A few proposed that any major decisions required a community-wide vote, instead of being dictated by a handful of board members. It was refreshing to watch. For the first time in years, the HOA was actually serving the people instead of ruling over them. When the final decisions were made, the changes were radical but necessary. The majority of the fines were eliminated, the HOA fees were cut nearly in half, and every policy was rewritten with input from the homeowners. The people who had once feared every letter they received from the HOA now found themselves in charge of their own neighborhood again. As satisfying as these victories were, there was still one last loose end to tie up: Gregory himself. Though stripped of his power, he had not disappeared. In fact, he had been lurking in the background, refusing to accept his fate. He had attempted to file complaints against the new board, claiming that the election had been fraudulent. When that failed, he tried to stir up fear among homeowners, warning them that the chaos of self-governance would drive property values down. But his words carried no weight anymore. The community had turned against him, and the more he tried to regain control, the more pathetic he looked. The final blow came when I presented the findings of the financial audit to the homeowners. The proof of Gregory's fraud was undeniable. Everything was laid out in clear numbers: how he had stolen from them, manipulated them, and used their money to fund his personal luxuries. The homeowners had once feared him, but now their anger burned brighter than their old fear ever had. They wanted him gone, completely and permanently. With the evidence in hand, the new board filed an official complaint against Gregory. The authorities were notified, and an investigation was launched. Gregory had spent years abusing the system, convinced that no one would ever have the courage to fight back. But he had underestimated his neighbors. He had underestimated me. The day the police arrived at his house, the entire neighborhood watched. It was poetic in a way, seeing the man who had ruled over them for so long reduced to nothing. He came out of his house looking disheveled, still clinging to whatever dignity he had left. As he was escorted to the squad car, his eyes scanned the crowd, searching for some sign of support. But there was none. No one stood by him. No one spoke on his behalf. The homeowners who had once feared his power now looked at him with contempt. As he was driven away, a slow clap started from somewhere in the crowd. Then another. Then another. Before long, the entire neighborhood was clapping, cheering, laughing. It wasn't just a celebration of Gregory's downfall. It was a celebration of their freedom. But for me, there was still one final step to take. The HOA, though transformed, was still under my financial control. I had bought it to save the neighborhood from Gregory's tyranny, but now that the job was done, I didn't want to hold on to it forever. The best way to truly give people their power back was to remove any single point of control, even if that point was me. So, I made one last decision. I sold the HOA, not to another management company, but to the homeowners themselves. Every resident became a shareholder, with equal voting rights and equal ownership. The power was now truly in their hands. There would be no more corrupt presidents, no more unchecked authority, just neighbors working together to maintain their community on their own terms. The day I finalized the sale, I received an email. It was from Gregory. His message was short, bitter, and filled with resentment. "I hope you're happy. You ruined my life." I read it twice, then smiled as I typed my response. "You're welcome." I closed my laptop and stepped outside, breathing in the fresh air of a neighborhood that was finally free. The houses looked the same, the streets hadn't changed, but the feeling in the air was completely different. There was laughter, conversation, life. No one was looking over their shoulder anymore. No one was walking on eggshells. The community had taken back what was rightfully theirs. I had moved here hoping for a quiet life, but what I found was something better. I had found a purpose. I had found a way to give people the justice they deserved. And now, with everything settled, I could finally sit back and enjoy the home I had fought so hard to protect. The HOA was dead, and in its place, a real community had been born. The neighborhood had finally returned to what it was always supposed to be, a place where people could actually live in peace. No more harassment, no more pointless fines, no more power-hungry board members treating homeowners like their personal cash cows. The air felt lighter, as if the entire community had taken a deep breath for the first time in years. People were outside more, chatting with neighbors. Kids were riding bikes without parents anxiously looking over their shoulders. And front yards that had once been meticulously micromanaged by the HOA now reflected the actual personalities of the homeowners. The transformation was something that had to be seen to be believed. Gregory was gone. His name had become a joke, a ghost of a time that no one wanted to remember. No one spoke about him except in passing, and even then, it was with a dismissive laugh, as if he had never really mattered. He had tried to hold on to power for as long as he could, but in the end, he was nothing without the HOA to shield him. Without his position, without his ability to find and threaten people into submission, he had become just another bitter man with nowhere to direct his anger. His house, once the symbol of authority in the neighborhood, now sat dark and lifeless, a reminder of how quickly everything he had built had crumbled. But while the community had moved on, Gregory hadn't. He was still lurking, still trying to stir up trouble in whatever way he could. He sent letters to the homeowners filled with warnings about how their new system would fail, about how property values would plummet without strong leadership. He even tried to file a lawsuit against the new HOA board, claiming they had illegally removed him from his position. That lawsuit went nowhere. The evidence of his fraud was airtight, and no judge was willing to entertain the ramblings of a disgraced former HOA president. Then, in the ultimate twist of fate, Gregory himself was found to be in violation of multiple HOA rules. The very same rules he had ruthlessly enforced on others now came back to haunt him. His backyard, which had once been perfectly landscaped according to his own absurd standards, had become an overgrown mess. His fence was not within regulation height. His garbage cans were left visible from the street, and his driveway had several cracks in it, something he had fined other homeowners for in the past. The new board, now acting in fairness and without personal bias, gave him the standard warning process, the same process that he had refused to grant to anyone else. But Gregory, being Gregory, refused to acknowledge it. He ignored the letters, then ignored the second warnings, thinking he was above the rules that he had created. Except this time, there was no one to protect him. When the fines piled up, Gregory made one last desperate attempt to turn the homeowners against the board, claiming that they had become just as bad as he had been. But no one believed him. Everyone could see the difference between real, fair enforcement and the tyranny he had once imposed. And then, finally, the moment of poetic justice arrived. Gregory, the man who had evicted countless homeowners over trivial violations, was officially evicted himself. It was the middle of the afternoon when the trucks arrived. Gregory had fought it as long as he could, But in the end, he had no choice. The law was the law, and this time it wasn't being manipulated in his favor. The entire neighborhood came out to watch. No one helped him pack. No one offered him a kind word. Some people took pictures, others whispered among themselves. But no one intervened. He tried to keep his dignity, walking stiffly to his car, but the humiliation was too great. He had ruled over this neighborhood like a king, but now he was just another man being forced out of his home. As he pulled away, he didn't look at anyone. He didn't say a word. He simply disappeared down the street, never to return. That night, the neighborhood held a celebration. It wasn't just about Gregory's eviction. It was about everything that had changed. There was music, food, laughter, and for the first time in years, people felt like they truly owned their homes. The relief in the air was impossible to describe. People who had once kept their heads down and avoided HOA meetings were now discussing ways to improve the community together. There were no more threats, no more intimidation, just people finally free to live their lives without constant fear of punishment for the smallest infractions. I stood back, watching it all unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. It was strange to think about how everything had started. I had bought this house expecting a peaceful place to live, only to be met with threats of eviction over nonsense. Now, months later, I had not only secured my own home, but had helped free an entire community from the grasp of a corrupt system. The HOA still existed in name, but it was no longer a tool for power. It was a collective effort by the homeowners, built on fairness and transparency. As I was about to head inside, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see one of the new board members, a middle-aged woman named Karen, not the HOA Karen type, but the complete opposite. She had been one of the first people to push back against Gregory and had played a big role in helping get the votes needed to remove him. "We never really got the chance to thank you," she said, holding out a beer, "for everything." I took it with a smile. "I didn't do it alone," I said. "It was all of us." She nodded, taking a sip from her own drink. "Still, you started it. You gave people the courage to fight back." I shrugged. "I just wanted to live in peace." She laughed. "Well, you got more than you bargained for." That was true. I had never planned on getting involved in a war against a power-hungry HOA board. But in the end, it had been worth it. The neighborhood had changed for the better, and I had proven something important, not just to Gregory, but to everyone. People like him only have power as long as others let them. The moment people push back, the illusion of control shatters. A few weeks later, I received one last email from Gregory. I almost didn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was short, bitter, and dripping with resentment. "You think you won, but neighborhoods don't run themselves. Sooner or later, you'll realize that you need someone like me." I stared at the words for a moment, then simply deleted the email without responding. There was nothing left to say. Gregory was gone, and the neighborhood was thriving without him. In the end, he had been wrong about everything. The community didn't need him. And the biggest joke of all was that I had never even wanted to get involved in the first place. I just wanted to live my life. But fate had a funny way of pulling people into battles they never planned to fight. And this time, the good guys had won. The weeks following Gregory's eviction were some of the most peaceful I had ever experienced. The neighborhood had settled into a new rhythm, one that felt natural rather than forced. Without the looming threat of absurd fines or constant surveillance, people began to enjoy their homes in a way they never had before. It was like watching an entire community wake up from a long, exhausting nightmare. Yards were being decorated the way homeowners actually wanted them to be. Kids' bicycles were left on driveways without fear of a warning letter. People were gathering on their porches, talking to one another, reconnecting in ways that had been impossible under Gregory's rule. I had never been the type to get involved in community politics, but somehow, I had become the unofficial leader of this transformation. It wasn't something I had planned. It had just happened naturally. People started coming to me for advice, asking me what I thought about certain changes or if I had any insight on how to handle things. At first, I hesitated. I had never wanted to run an HOA, not even one that was fair. But over time, I realized that the best thing I could do was help transition things so that no one person had too much control ever again. One of the first things the new board did was remove the old system of unchecked power. No more small groups making major decisions without the input of the people who actually lived here. We implemented a voting system where homeowners had a say in everything. If a new policy was proposed, it had to go through the entire community before it could be enforced. If someone had a complaint, It was addressed by a fair panel rather than a dictator with a grudge. Every financial decision was made transparently, with records available to anyone who wanted to see them. It was democracy at its finest, and the best part was that people actually cared. They showed up, they participated, and they made sure that what had happened under Gregory would never happen again. There was still one final decision I had to make, and it was something I had been thinking about for a while. While I had never officially been on the HOA board, I still technically owned the financial structure of it. That was the one thing that hadn't changed yet. I had been the one to buy out the HOA's debt, which meant, in a technical sense, I still held power over it. Even though I had used that power to fix things, I knew I couldn't hold on to it forever. The entire point of what I had done was to give the community back to the people, and that meant stepping away completely. One evening, I called an emergency meeting, not because there was a problem, but because I had a final announcement to make. The homeowners gathered, some looking concerned, others just curious about what was so important that it couldn't wait for the next regular meeting. I stood at the front of the community center, looking out at the people who had once been terrified to speak up, but now sat with confidence, knowing they had a voice. I explained everything: how I had originally bought the HOA's debt, how I had technically been in control this entire time, and how I had used that control to dismantle the corruption that had existed before. Some people were shocked, some weren't. A few of them even laughed, shaking their heads at the irony of it all. But the real reason I had called them together was to tell them that I was officially handing over the HOA to them, not just in terms of leadership, but in full ownership. I had set up a structure that allowed every homeowner to be a shareholder in the HOA itself. No single person would ever have complete power again. Every major decision would require a vote from the community. The reaction was better than I could have hoped for. People clapped, cheered, some even stood up and shook my hand. It was the final piece of the puzzle, the last step in making sure that no one could ever do what Gregory had done again. It was in their hands now, and I knew, looking at their faces, that they were ready. After the meeting, as people slowly filed out, a few neighbors stuck around to chat. Some wanted to thank me personally. Others just wanted to talk about the future of the neighborhood. It was strange to think about how much had changed in such a short time. Just months ago, these same people had been too scared to even question the ridiculous rules imposed on them. Now, they were making decisions for themselves, openly discussing ways to improve things. It was exactly what I had hoped for. Later that night, I sat on my porch, watching as the last few homeowners headed back to their houses. It felt good knowing that I had done the right thing. I had never expected to get involved in any of this, but now that it was over, I felt a sense of accomplishment that was hard to describe. I wasn't just some guy who had bought a house anymore. I had changed something. I had helped people take back their lives, and that was something no amount of money or power could replace. As I leaned back in my chair, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw an email notification. The sender's name made me pause: Gregory. I debated whether or not to even open it, but curiosity got the better of me. The email was short, bitter, and exactly what I expected from him. You think you've won, but neighborhoods don't run themselves. Sooner or later, you'll see that people need structure, and when that happens, they'll wish they had someone like me in charge. I stared at the words for a moment, then deleted the email without responding. Gregory would never understand what had happened here. He would never accept that people were capable of running their own lives without someone lording over them. He would spend the rest of his days convinced that he had been the victim in all of this, that he had been wronged. But none of that mattered anymore. He was gone, and the community had moved on. The weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood continued to thrive without the constant pressure of an oppressive HOA. People took real pride in their homes, not because they were afraid of fines, but because they actually cared. The board continued to function fairly. Decisions were made as a group, and every voice mattered. There were no more secret meetings, no more ridiculous rules designed to make money, just people living their lives the way it should have always been. As for me, I finally got what I had wanted from the start: a peaceful home. No stress, no threats, no unnecessary drama. Just a place to relax, enjoy life, and know that my neighbors were happy too. It was funny how things had played out. I had never wanted to fight a battle against an HOA. I had just wanted to live in peace. But sometimes, the battles you don't expect are the ones that matter the most. And in the end, I hadn't just won. We all had.